So the story of Libra, and indeed of blockchain in general, starts about 12,000 BC. And it starts with what I call the world's first business requirement. And it's not an accident that it starts around this time, because this is about the time when humans start making the transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculture, and we start seeing the emergence of the first cities. And that fundamentally changes the way people interact. And specifically, this requirement is the ability to have an independently verifiable record of an agreement between two parties. This isn't important as hunter-gatherers, because there is no need to make a commitment about the future, because you don't know what the future is going to hold. But the moment you start getting into the seasonality and the predictability of planting crops one year after the next, you start thinking about the future. And that creates a new set of needs and a new set of opportunities for the innovators of that day, who are surprisingly similar in their behaviors to the innovators of this day. And we're going to talk through an early use case. So I want you to imagine all that you're living in the cradle of civilization, ancient Sumeria, and you have a farm, okay? And you have a farm by the river, and you grow wheat, and you have a brother or a sister who has a farm about the same size as yours, right next to yours. And the two of you, have been farming this land year in and year out. And the size of your farm is dictated by how much you can plow in a given season. So you have a pair of oxen, and they pull one of these very traditional stock plows with no wheels and a stone head for tilling the earth. And the amount that you can cover in the time you've got is how big your farm is. And your brother's farm is identically sized. One year, while taking his wheat to market, your brother is ambushed by bandits and killed, and they take his ox. And you've got a problem, because now you have to look after your brother's family, and your oxen aren't enough to plow your brother's fields as well as your own, and your brother's family will starve if you can't find a solution. So you talk to somebody else in your area who has an extra ox. Maybe their oxen gave birth this year, and you do a deal, okay? And this is a new deal, because this is not something that happened as hunter-gatherers. You basically say, if you lend me your oxen for 2 weeks, I can plow my brother's fields, and at harvest time, I will give you 10 bushels of grain. So you do the deal, and you plow the fields, and harvest time comes, and you come and you give this person your 10 bushels of grain, and the person says, "What? Wait, you told me 12. He said, no, I told you 10. Trust breaks down. Next year, you won't be able to do the deal, because you don't trust each other, and you've got a serious problem, because your brother's family risks starving. So the innovators of that day, a group of thinkers, used the resources they had at the time to come up with a solution. And this is ancient Sumeria, so this is between the floodplains of the Tigris and the Euphrates. And the one resource that they had in great quantity was mud. So they took this mud, and they built this thing, which is called a bulla. Okay, and a bulla is a clay ball, and inside the bulla they put, tokens. Tokens, not new. Okay, these tokens each represented a bushel of grain. They would make this ball together, the two people making the agreement, and then they would fire this mud in a kiln, and at harvest time they would break it open, and there was an independently verifiable record of how many bushels of grain were the deal. This was huge. Okay, this allowed you to make the same deal year after year after year, and again, the thinkers of that time now had a way to think beyond just one farm. Because if I can do this with one ox, why can't I do it with 20? So this happened about 12,000 BC. You go into the British Museum, you can see some of these. They still have some of them around. And we see farms starting to grow, because somebody starts to think, well, if I can get 20 oxen, I can now grow my farm. So people start thinking at this time around growing their business for the first time. And so imagine this happens and we hit a new obstacle, okay? It's one glorious summer day and I walk into my storehouse and I see I've got 30 of these bulla sitting in my storehouse and I realize I don't remember how many tokens are in each, okay? So I hit a barrier, okay? And this whole story from then to now is about hitting these barriers and solving them. And the first barrier is one of scale, okay? The scale is limited, the limitation on scale is my memory of having to remember how many tokens are in each bulla. The innovators of the day, and this was probably about 400 or 500 years after, were up to the task and came up with the next innovation, which was when they made these bulla, they would then take the tokens and they would make these impressions in there and so that you had a way of counting on the outside how many tokens were on the inside. Okay, this was another huge step. So now it was the limitation of how big I could grow my farm was no longer based on the capacity of my personal memory registers. I now had a way of verifying without breaking this, this thing open. Okay, and the next barrier, if you like, was one of complexity, okay? I had no way of knowing, let's say I start growing a crop. Let's say I start growing barley as well, because I like my beer. I had no way of placing it. Or maybe I wanted to do something that says, I'll give you 10 bushels at the beginning of harvest and a further 5 at the end of harvest, after I've given it to other people. So having a sense of time. So what they did next was they started getting more complex about the things they wrote on the outside. Okay, so they developed conventions that says a cross might mean a bushel of wheat, and and an X might mean a bushel of barley. So this grew and grew and grew until somebody said, had an aha moment, saying actually what's on the outside now conveys a lot more information than tokens. And these things are fragile, so instead I'll just flatten it, and what you end up with is the world's first writing. Now the order of this is interesting, as is the timing, because bulla existed about 4,000 years before writing did. So from that very first early primitive bulla to this, we're looking at about 4,000 years. So for 4,000 years, people were expressing contracts, okay? And then for a further 1,000 years, these writings were only contracts. It took another millennia before people said, hey, I can use this for law, I can use this for religion, I can use this for literature, I can use this for music. All of the other things we use writing for. For 1,000 years, this was only for contracts. It tells you how important this business requirement is. Okay? So this created a huge step forward in our ability to create more complex contracts, but it too had barriers. For one thing, we lost the independent verifiability. There's only one of these. So the ability to break the bulla open was lost and count the number of tokens in it. It also, it's also not very portable, it's very fragile. So the next big invention to reintroduce verifiability and portability was this thing. People know what this is? Anybody? It's called a tally stick. Okay? Tally sticks, the first reference we have to them were in the days of the early Roman Republic, so before the Roman Empire, about 100, 200 BC. We start seeing mention of these things. They were accepted as proof of a contract or proof of debt all the way up into Napoleonic courts. So they had a good long run. And the way you use a tally stick is you make etchings across a piece of wood and then broke the wood in two so that two parties could have an independently verifiable record of a contract or of a transaction. And they would fit together uniquely so that you could validate. Interesting bit of trivia. Well, actually, two interesting bits. One is, if you ever remember counting things when you were a kid, going 1, 2, 3, 4, and then across 5, you're using the method that they did to inscribe on tally sticks. That's where it came from, and that's why those marks are called tallies. Okay. The other interesting thing is, whenever you broke a tally stick apart, there was always a bigger half and the smaller half. The bigger half always went to the creditor, the person who owed the debt. Okay? The smaller half was called the foil, and the bigger half, the one that went to the creditor, was called the stock. Okay? So if you were the person with the bigger half, you were said to have stock in the other person's product. And that's where the term stock came from. So again, a huge step forward, but loss of complexity. So also, this solved the problem of scale to the next level, because you could have hundreds or thousands of these things. Very famously, during the English Civil War, they burned a huge number of these tallies at the Royal Treasury. They just took all of the tallies that represented how much people owed the king, and they made a big bonfire out of them. But so by the time we had an exchequer in Britain, the exchequer had thousands of these tallies representing their financial accounts. Next step to solve complexity happened around 800 AD, and it was this thing which is called a chirograph. And a chirograph is essentially a contract that had multiple parts, all of which were identical, all of which said the same thing, and the parties, the various parties, and then you cut it along these wiggly lines so that it would fit back together, and you would be sure that you had, again, an independently verifiable record of the same thing. So the chirograph was about 18, like I said, about 800 AD, and it again reintroduced the ability to model complexity into these multi-party agreements, and still have something that was independently verifiable. Next big innovation happened in Korea in the 1100s, but was then lost when the Chinese invaded Korea, and then was independently invented in the late 1300s by, again, a friar named Luca Pacioli. Has anyone ever studied the history of accounting? Okay, so some people nodding heads know who Luca Pacioli was. And he invented the next tool that sort of took it to the next level, which was to have, again, independently verifiable records, and that's double entry accounting. So this solved, again, many barriers. It removed barriers: complexity, scalability, and independent verifiability without having to have a chirograph in triplicate. This was such a huge innovation that there were basically no or only marginal or incremental innovations between the late 1300s and about the 1950s. Okay, so modeling contracts, modeling ledgers, modeling business commitments had only minor changes for about 600 years. That's what a powerful innovation this was. The innovation that this hit was again one of scale, the barrier this hit. When we started thinking about wanting to trade across borders and to have what we now think of as a truly global enterprise, this couldn't scale because you have an exponential growth of the number of clerks required, and the number of filers required, and the number of archives required. But we see this in the way data scales with large companies. When a company grows from 10 to 100 to 1,000 people, their data processing needs don't just scale linearly, they scale exponentially. And a manual paper-based system wasn't able to keep up with that. So the next big innovation we have was the ability to digitize these ledgers. The first ledger that went live was in 1955, and it was a payroll system for General Electric in White Plains, New York, using the UNIVAC computer. And it again, this innovation created or made possible the multinational corporation as we know it now. This allowed you to then scale out your commitments across a much wider field, and to start thinking about business models that you could not have conceived of because of the sheer critical mass of keeping track of that much paper. So this was huge, and it led us to the next obstacle. So things grew and companies grew, and the obstacle that it ran into, starting in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, was one of sovereignty. Okay, you now could conceive of a business that operated on a truly global scale, but governments didn't like that. They didn't like it because each government has its own system of laws and would expect a corporation to behave. Each government had its own unit of account, So the idea of a corporation having a single unit account that works across its enterprise is something that is still a barrier. The attempts to deal with that barrier, things like SWIFT, for instance, are very, very cumbersome, very difficult to use, require teams of dedicated experts to make it work with anything resembling efficiency. And the first attempt that gained any traction to solve that was, of course, something that everyone in this room will recognize, which was Bitcoin. So Bitcoin was the first attempt to envision breaking this barrier, this next obstacle in this first business requirement, an independently verifiable agreement between parties. So Bitcoin created a system that did not need to worry about these barriers of sovereignty. And it was a huge innovation. It's 10 years old now. But it had some problems, and I'm not actually thinking about the criminality as a problem. And the reason I'm not thinking about a problem is that criminal enterprises have an inbuilt first mover advantage. So there's nothing unique about Bitcoin that makes it attractive to criminal enterprises. Criminal enterprises were the first, on the scene for internet providers, the first on the scene for mobile providers. The scam artists, by virtue of the fact that they, by definition, have no governance and don't really have to care about the end customer, will always be first to these innovations. So it's completely unsurprising that they were first to Bitcoin. They will be the first for pretty much every new technology. The problem that I'm referring to is one of complexity. And the analog that I like to use is the MP3 player. The iPod was not the first MP3 player. There were dozens of them invented prior to the iPod. We owned one. We loved it, by the way. But the problem, and the reason that they did not become ubiquitous in the way that the iPod did, was one of complexity. They were hard to figure out how to use. Okay, they were not well designed, they were not intuitive. You had to understand a fair bit of technical depth to be able to use one effectively. What the iPod did was solve that. Okay, it presented an interface that was easy to use, that was intuitive. So it solved it. And that brings us really to Libra. Libra has the potential, and I say the potential because none of us have actually seen it in operation, but Libra has the potential to be the iPod to the Bitcoin's MP3 player. Okay, it has the potential to create the same sort of removal of the sovereignty barrier in a way that is simple, intuitive, and easy for someone to use. Bitcoin is not easy for people to use. You have to understand what a public key and a private key is. You have to look at and be bewildered by these randomly generated pieces of information. You have to decide whether you want a hardware wallet or a mobile wallet or a software wallet or even a paper wallet. Okay, this is not something that we can reasonably expect most people to master and deal with. So it really limits the adoption and the uptake, this complexity. Libra has the potential to solve that. Okay, they have, again, the potential to put together a very simple to use interface attached to something everybody knows, which is Facebook, and do this in a way that removes the design complexity. So, next question to ask is, so what? Why is this such a big deal? And it is, at least in my mind. And to talk about that, I want to talk about a study they did in Tanzania. Tanzania, they looked at single-person businesses. And by single-person business, you have to think about this in as broad terms as possible. You're talking about a guy selling food on the street, or a guy who happens to own a truck. And because he owns a truck, he is a logistics business. He is an overnight courier. He is a mover. He does anything he can with this truck to get by. And they looked over a period of about 2.5 years and said, of all these single-person businesses, and there were, they numbered in the hundreds of thousands in a country that I think is about 20 million people. How many of these businesses succeed to the point where they go from having one employee to 10 or more employees in 2.5 years? And they found that 2% of businesses succeeded or emerged. They called it emerging micro business. in that 2.5 years. So a very small number. Okay. However, that 2% created over a quarter of all new jobs in the country. So think about that. So what if, by some method, we could get that 2% even to 3%? Okay? By enabling these businesses to buy and sell goods overseas, or by making it easier for them to get credit, which is a lot of what my firm does around financial inclusion. By doing anything to make these tiny businesses to succeed, we can radically transform an economy. And we did this in Kenya. I led the project that used machine learning to generate credit scores for small businesses who have no bank account, so that they could have access to microcredit. The number of loans that was available to these small businesses over M-Pesa went from between 2 to 500 a day, peaking at over 50,000 a day. So we radically transformed it, and the GDP 1 year after doubled. Okay, so the effect of this is real. Okay, and Libra is another one of these enabling technologies. It has the potential to completely change facts on the ground. And in places where the currencies failed, like Zimbabwe or Venezuela, this has the ability to be no more or less than an absolute lifesaver, and will mean the difference between living and dying. This is serious. And you're going to hear from some of the speakers today, especially from Jeff, who I have just profound respect for, about some very real concerns. We'll get to Q&A in a second. About some very real concerns about concentration of data and concentration of knowledge and lack of respect for privacy. These concerns are real, they are well-founded, and they need to be solved. But the message I would leave you with is solve them, because this is the first chance we have to do something that is going to make a significant difference in the lives of about between 1.5 and 2 billion people. Not us, okay? I've got a good friend who actually runs a microfinance institution in Rwanda. He describes data privacy as the ultimate first world problem. He says if you ask anybody in Rwanda, I'm going to give you access and the ability to sell your crafts, your services overseas, or to receive remittances directly without having to worry about your country's Byzantine capital flight requirements. But you have to give me all your data so I can serve you ads. They're going to say, yeah, where do I sign? Fine. Okay. Now, I don't think that's good enough. I mean, I think that we need to hold, we can't create a double standard just because somebody's living in a less developed country, even if they're willing to. But we need to solve this, because this is something that most of the world desperately needs.
Please put your hands together. Areiel actually did one of the first blockchain projects for IBM in 2014, 2015, something like that. And he still is doing it today. So terrific experience there as a background. Thank you.